Hello and welcome to the first session of the second series of digital materialities webinar series. We are delighted to conduct this webinar series for a second year in a row, Géraldine, Véron, Joie, and myself. I'll just put a link to the other sessions in the chat for you to check out if you're interested. The next session is going to be on the 14th of February, same time, same place, a different link, but it's the same place to register. And we'll be listening to Anne-Valérie Dulac, who is a fellow at l'ARCA, research unit here in Université de Paris, and also the Maison Française d'Oxford, and she'll be talking about portrait miniatures on vellum. Still the relationship between images and their materiality, but way back in the 16th and 17th century. I'll now leave Géraldine to introduce our first speaker, Jonathan.
Okay, merci Ariane. Thank you. I would like to thank Ariane for co-hosting this new series with me. It's a pleasure to be back for a second year. And I would like to welcome you all to this first webinar. And I would like now to introduce Jonathan Dentler. We're very honored to have Jonathan Dentler as our first speaker. He's currently the Terra Foundation for American Art postdoctoral research and teaching fellow in Paris. And he's associated with the l'ARCA at Université de Paris and the research group of Paris-Nanterre. Jonathan received his PhD recently from USC. And his dissertation is a global history of wire photography services. And well, Jonathan, the floor is yours, so to speak. If you want to add anything about you, about the presentation today, feel free. And I would like also to remind everybody that Jonathan will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we have the equal amount of time dedicated to questions and answers. All right. And please disable your mics when Jonathan talks. Okay, that will be more comfortable for everybody. All right. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I don't really have anything to add to that other than to say that I guess most of this paper comes from a section of my fourth chapter, which is about the American Office of War Information and its global effort to spread picture propaganda and news through radio photography. But other than that, I'll just share my screen and get underway. So, when Charles Lindbergh made his transatlantic flight in 1927, the news photo agency Pacific and Atlantic Photos transmitted this picture of his arrival in Paris back to New York by cable from London. The picture is visually poor, with most of the finer gray tones having fallen out due to the transmission process. Yet what might seem at first glance like a bug was, I suggest, a feature. The picture's lack of visual detail was evidence of its infrastructural path beneath the waves. This formal quality set up a productive interplay between the picture's denotative content, the flyer who has bridged space, and connotations of transatlantic connectivity. As metaphor, the pilot visualized how wire photography used telecommunications infrastructure to stitch, bind, and link distant places into a simultaneously unfolding visible present. Examining how pictures moved through North America and the Atlantic Ocean in the 18th and early 19th centuries, art historian Jennifer Roberts has argued that pictures register the complications of their own transmissions through space, and formally pre-process the distances they are designed to span. Roberts also suggests that the advent of telegraphy in the 19th century made pictures conspicuously weighty and slow in comparison to words, since their materiality made them resistant to code and transmission. In the 20th century, wire photography used a type of photo scanning device similar to a fax machine to separate images from their material supports as analog information. This was an important moment in the history of material culture, I would suggest, because it was the first time that commercial operations, mostly the press, began to transmit images as dematerialized information using communications infrastructure rather than as physical objects. In this, these pictures prefigured many aspects of the so-called digital era. As media theorist John Durham Peters has pointed out, infrastructure's typical mode is to withdraw from view, and it is often concealed by design. In the interwar period, however, wire photos tended to visually register traces of their bumpy paths through circuits, electrical interference, and adverse weather patterns. Rather than merely reflecting a pre-existing physical or political geography, wire photography produced a new cultural space as the interface at which people perceived and contemplated transatlantic networks, serving as visible proof of infrastructural connections and indicating a connection between what Henri Lefebvre called the production of space and changing forms of material culture. Such images traded quality for speed. In her work on contemporary image providers such as Agence France Presse, anthropologist Zeynep Gersel shows that wire photography services have traditionally thought of their images as fast pictures as opposed to good pictures. My point isn't to assess whether these images are good or bad, but rather to attend to the ways that they structured and conditioned the emergence of a new cultural geography defined by one's relative degree of connectivity to telecommunications and photo printing infrastructure. Wire photos sutured viewers to a horizon of simultaneously mediated and collectively witnessed events. In the interwar period, this technology developed out of transatlantic zigzags in research and development. Wire photos themselves were often used to picture transatlantic events such as sports competitions or political summits, or transportation technologies such as airplanes, airships, and steamships. Such images provided audiences connected by transatlantic communications infrastructure with collective experiences of simultaneously mediated visual news. Communication hubs such as New York, London, or Buenos Aires formed the core of an interwar Atlantic network in which news pictures circulated by wire, radio, and airplane. However, only with great difficulty could this network reach beyond the places where visual telecommunications infrastructure and its attendant media such as halftone photo engraving and mass daily newspapers existed. In this sense, while wire photography seemed to annihilate space and time, and this is how it was often discussed, between regions separated by large stretches of ocean, for areas outside the geography traced by this organizational and infrastructural network, distance expanded relative to that system's interior. As global historian Roland Wenzelhumer has argued, space is essentially relative. That is to say, it is always produced by relations between objects in a given system. Time and space cannot actually be annihilated. Instead, communications infrastructure creates new spatial relations, arranging and connecting places, people, and things into new constellations. Thus, wire photography's visually mediated space-time compression simultaneously produced an outside defined by its relative distance from new picture distribution networks. In this talk, I will first demonstrate how wire photography produced a new transatlantic cultural space premised on visual engagement with events mediated as telecommunications images. Then I will show how the production of this space also constituted a liminal zone as its border or exterior by addressing the American Office of War Information's attempt to integrate Central Africa into this infrastructural and cultural system during World War II. The Lindbergh photograph shown earlier was transmitted using the Bartlane process, which was a form of image transmission that scanned a picture and converted its tones into a punched strip of telegraph paper. This punched strip was transmitted by undersea cable and reconverted into an image on the receiving end. After World War I, the London Daily Mail sponsored H.G. Bartholomew and M.D. McFarlane to develop the technology. And the early efforts produced images such as these. Bartholomew and McFarlane had made transatlantic tests in 1920 during the international yacht race, and in 1921 for the Dempsey-Carpentier boxing match in New Jersey. The Daily Mirror published the pictures, but judged the system unsuitable for permanent commercial use. In 1924, however, the New York Daily News and the Chicago Tribune sponsored further tests, which led to technical progress and a regular commercial service between London, New York, and Chicago. An educational and promotional film produced in 1934 entitled 3,000 Miles Under the Sea demonstrated the process. And I'd like to show, I think there should be time, but I'd like to show a bit of that film. Can you see the film? It's silent. No, you can't see it? Do you see just my slideshow? Do you see it now, the film?
No,
Still no, huh?
we see the kind of slides on the left-hand side and then your main slide.
Let me stop share. Share screen again. How about now?
I think that's going to work.
Okay. This is in New York. They've been informed that London wants to transmit a picture. Got it. London wants that picture. So speaking of digital materialities too, I'll just say that this was on really old Kodak film stock at the Folkerding Center for Creative Photography in Tucson, Arizona. And so when I found it, it was just like in a film can, and I paid to have it be digitized. And only then could I, see what was on the film. So he's rolled up the picture and put it into the container that's going to be scanned and turned into a punched telegraph tape. You can see it's a very big panel with lots of transformers and it's a lot of equipment. This is earlier, this is 1934, I think, when this was made. But so it gets miniaturized a little bit over time. By World War II, when I'm in the period I'm going to talk about, they could sometimes make it down, compress it down into kind of like two really heavy suitcases. So now the light is scanning the picture. And in this one, it's actually not completely analog. It's actually a digital system, which is one of the reasons why I dislike the term digital era. I mean, I understand, you know, we have the jet age, which is like a period defined by a certain technology, but I'm a little bit unsatisfied whenever people say digital era, because, you know, digital technologies, the mosaic is a digital technology, which is obviously very old. And likewise, this wasn't a wholly analog technology either. Maybe I'll stop it there, but it punches telegraph paper, then that punched paper is transmitted, and at the other end, it can be reconstituted into an image. So I'll stop share, start share. And then what? Do you see the slideshow? Okay. Transatlantic radio photography developed in parallel with the cable method, but traveled through the ether rather than under the sea. Using wartime patents held by a German engineer, the Radio Corporation of America began developing transatlantic radio photography in 1923 and opened a commercial connection with London in 1925. By the mid-1920s, then, pictures, which had previously taken a week to cross the Atlantic by steamship, could be transmitted by cable or radio and printed in daily newspapers roughly a day after the event itself. In Germany, telecommunications companies such as Siemens and AEG quickly began developing their own systems. As historian Heidi Torek has argued, many in interwar Germany saw radio as a path to freedom that would, a Weg ins Freie, that would provide a way around British control over telegraph cables reaching into the Atlantic. In 1925, the German Post Office and Siemens Telefunken began planning a radio photo system, and by 1931 opened links between Berlin, Buenos Aires, and New York. A decade after Lindbergh's flight, when the Hindenburg exploded above New Jersey, transatlantic radio photography was the primary means for transporting spot pictures of the event to Buenos Aires, Berlin, and London. Photos were then brought by plane to cities such as Paris, which this is the one in the Parisian newspaper. This is the one in Stettin. The halftone reproduced in the Stettiner Generalanzeiger shows little in the way of evident retouching, although the image does register the radio photo raster process. That's the little vertical lines that you can see on the image. Once again, wire photo's connotative meaning was strongly associated with the apparent collapse of geographic distance, emphasized by the interplay between the visible traces of the transmission process and an iconographic content of space bridging transportation technology, so the Zeppelin. While the first radio photo connections reflected an Atlantic cultural geography, radio was by its nature less tied to geographic space than were cables. As radio photography expanded in the following years and decades, it gradually replaced cable picture transmission and also supplanted what had been a largely transatlantic cultural geography of telecommunicated images with a global one. Radio photography was also the means by which the American OWI sought to reach Central Africa with spot news pictures during World War II. Established in late 1941, the OWI radio photo section effectively became a wire photography service on an unprecedented global scale. It established operations in places where private photo agencies had never distributed pictures, since there was no chance of recovering profits from these areas. Brazzaville and Leopoldville, lying in the Congo Basin, and at that time the capitals of l'Afrique Équatoriale Française, or AEF, and Congo Belge, respectively, became one of the first OWI overseas radio photo installations. By installing radio photo infrastructure, the OWI attempted to connect colonized populations to wire photography's visual public sphere, reshaping spatial relations between the colonies and Europe that had already been disrupted by German occupation of the metropole in 1940. This OWI photograph from mid-1943 shows a group of African youths looking at an OWI photo display board in the window of a large building, probably in Accra on the in the British Gold Coast colony, present-day Ghana. The OWI often used such display boards to spread its news and propaganda messages, and they were particularly important in societies in which literacy and newspaper reading were not widespread. The board shows scenes from various theaters of the war from around the world, equipment such as bombers and aircraft carriers, and portraits of leaders such as Roosevelt. Its title reads, "The New Juju, Power plus Cooperation equals Victory." Juju is a catch-all term derived from juju, a toy or plaything, to denote a spiritual belief system associated with African animist religions, which involves the use of objects and spells deployed for their magical efficacy. But it's important to historicize this term because in many cases, Western observers used it far too broadly as a catch-all term and thereby misapprehending African spiritual practices. The caption on the verso reads, "Somewhere in Central Africa, June 14th, 1943. Clustered about OWI picture exhibit showing the new juju or witch doctor magic of the Allies. African natives look at photographs of United Nations activity in the war for freedom." It is difficult to determine to what degree this photograph was staged, but I think it's revealing regardless. The caption may have been created with an element of humor to flatter Europeans and Americans' sense of superiority in the idea that they knew better to believe in magic. Yet magic was often invoked with regard to wire and radio photography in North America and Europe as well, as this 1931 Bartlane photo demonstrates. I would suggest instead that the magic referenced in the title really refers to the fact of news photography itself as a globe-spanning infrastructure producing a new collective called the United Nations. Like magic, wire photos could make something invisible appear, not only the distant things they represented, but also the infrastructural network that enabled their speedy travel across the ocean. Whether staged or not, these young Africans knew that they were an intended audience for these pictures because they actively posed or were encouraged to pose as such an audience. The OWI radio photo program sought to suture Africans to a potential transnational public, part of what Ariella Azoulay has called the civil contract of photography. This public always remained more potential than real, however, for reasons that are both material and political. The radio photo section's efforts to propagandize Africans ultimately had little success, demonstrating the limits of the system I have already described, as well as the politics inherent in any infrastructurally produced cultural space. Far from creating a global village, telecommunications media can also exacerbate existing physical, societal, and political divides by making the places that it does not connect relatively more distant in infrastructural terms. In Central Africa, actually constructing a radio photo infrastructure was not an insurmountable problem. The more tenacious problems were the lack of photo engraving facilities and a mass newspaper audience, the difficulty of maintaining technology designed for a temperate North Atlantic climate in the humid tropics, and most decisively, colonial racism and racial hierarchies that militated against including Africans in a broad visual public sphere. At that time, there were only 2 daily newspapers in the Congo Basin. Both were published in Leopoldville and no photo engraving facilities. Responding to the lack of engraving facilities for printing radio photos in daily newspapers, the OWI capitalized on public spaces in colonial towns and villages for window displays like the one pictured here to spread visual news in places that in a way that did not require widespread literacy. The OWI also used something called a Davidson offset reproduction machine, which could cheaply print radio photos on pamphlets and posters without photo engraving. The OWI staff regularly rotated and supplemented display boards with newer photos and posted radio photo posters at cafes, restaurants, and other public places. In September 1942, the mayor of Libreville in Gabon informed the OWI's outpost chief in Leopoldville that the pamphlets and posters had, quote, immediately captured attention, especially of the natives. By February 1943, the office was distributing their weekly sheet of radio photos around Brazzaville and Leopoldville in hotels, cafes, stores, the cross-Congo ferries, hospitals, the post office, and, quote, any place else with some bare space. One example from January 1943 shows images brought by radio photography and printed with a Davidson press of a speech by FDR before United Nations diplomats, a large transport plane in Southern California, and a review of American troops by General Giraud in North Africa. Once again, the picture's content, an international political gathering and a new transportation method, echoes its internationally and infrastructurally mediated nature. The OWI mailed such sheets to the chef de département in the AEF, Cameroon, and Belgian Congo with instructions to post them in their territories. With the onset of the rainy season, however, the staff's morale plummeted and work progressed at a snail's pace. Humidity caused their Davidson machines' rubber ink rollers to swell, smudging the posters. The humidity even caused cement to soften, producing vibrations in the mechanism within the device with a sensitive light bulb inside the radio photo receiver, which caused an intermittent short in one of the circuits of the machine. That April, the outpost chief, Jack Eames, reported the, quote, hottest, wettest, insectiest month yet. By 10 in the morning, he wrote, a muggy blanket of heat begins to settle down on us. It sits there heavily and stickily until about 5 in the afternoon. Speaking for myself, the worst effect of this period has been an unshakable languor, finding myself staring stupidly at a letter or report and unable to do anything about it. He concluded that, quote, radio photos aren't much value in this territory anyway. It is as though the outpost chief wanted to draw a distinction between the tropic's unshakable languor and the speed called for in radio photography. Constant discussions of the climate's enervating effects may have served as a kind of cipher, underlining the ways in which this area was infrastructurally and politically outside wire photography's proper space and pace. The OWI personnel clearly believed that radio photos required mass-produced daily newspapers to really be effective. The radio photo engineer there informed New York that without a local photo engraving plant, quote, from a strictly radio photo point of view, I am wasting my time here. Eames reported that while the radio photo sheets had been, quote, going over fairly well, they constitute little more than a novelty. People here are not accustomed to seeing pictures of events immediately after they happen. And their principal reaction to radio photo is one of mild curiosity and a what will these Americans think up next attitude, which scarcely justifies the expense and labor involved in transmitting, receiving, and printing radio photos. If the Davidson machine could print a sufficient quantity of radio photos to produce a supplement for the newspapers, things would be different. But the Davidson is still limping along, barely able to turn out 1,000 copies at best. Eames suggested that radio photo's full impact relied on a public that had been trained to appreciate the latest pictorial news as more than a novelty, but instead a regular part of the overall media ecology in which events became mediated as news. In Eames' mind, radio photography's success depended not just on good transmissions, but on the ability to print transmitted images in newspapers en masse. The chief of the picture division in New York wrote to Eames that he also had doubts and that, quote, as the pictures are only being used for display and for supplements, I feel our radio photo operation could well be restricted. Ultimately, the OWI was never able to reconcile outreach to Africans with its cooperation with colonial administrations, and this contributed to the eventual scaling back of its Congo operation. On the issue of addressing Africans, Eames reported that, quote, "The French are unanimously convinced that the native population is on the Allied side and that propaganda among them is a waste. I remain, as before, unconvinced on this point." His French sources may have deliberately obscured colonial political dynamics from him. For, as historian Eric Jennings has shown, the Free French in fact tried hard to secure the consent and loyalty of Africans, who were crucial for the Republican cause after the defeat in 1940. After a tour of Central Africa in 1943, the OWI's executive director concluded that if the agency was to accept rule by a tiny white minority, then, quote, "No propaganda founded on a basic message of democracy and freedom can be voiced in those two colonies." Well, he hoped that post-war international cooperation would, quote, "include some supervisory mechanism whereby civilized nations which enjoy the right of ruling over primitive peoples would be held to standards of, quote, education and social and economic emancipation." He reasoned that, quote, "the time is not yet ripe to stress this theme, because the result of an American propaganda program directed at the natives would be to arouse and cause trouble among the more advanced few. The effect on the overwhelming majority would be absolutely nil." He called the radio display boards, quote, "rather overdone," and recommended cutting the operation down to one staff member who would focus on cultivating personal ties with the European elite rather than mass information activities directed at a larger public sphere that would include indigenous Africans. For the first time, wire photography allowed images to be separated from their material support as information, bridging the gap that telegraphy had opened between the textual and the visual. This infrastructure both emerged from and shaped a transatlantic visual culture, which then went global in part thanks to radio photo technology. Yet wire photography did not simply annihilate space. It would be more accurate to say that it rearranged it, bringing well-connected media hubs closer together while pushing less connected areas relatively further away. The OWI's unsuccessful attempt to reach Central Africa with radio photography demonstrates the difficulties of overcoming this new spatial arrangement and is worth bearing in mind with regard to today's so-called digital divide. I want to close by looking at another image which seems to meditate, I think, on these dynamics. It is from the New York Herald Tribune's masthead, which in this edition from January 5th, 1933, was placed directly above a radio photo depicting the South American ocean liner Atlantique on fire in the English Channel. The image is both a spatialized view of time and a temporalized vision of space. On the left, an old man contemplates the landscape of the past, the old world with its pyramids, classical Hellenic ruins, and a camel caravan. On the right, a youth points toward the future and the new world, distinguished by a factory, modern agriculture, a locomotive, and a telegraph pole. Separating the two and presumably occupying our present is that decisive technology of time discipline, the clock. Yet the image begs the question of just where in the world the two spaces might be at any given time, where these two times might meet and overlap, and whether the two figures might ever be able to turn and face one another. That's it. Thank you. Stop share.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this fascinating paper. So if you have any questions for Jonathan, please just unmute yourself or tell us and then unmute yourself.
I'm interested to know, actually, are you doing supplemental readings along with this? Like, are there certain themes that theories or ideas that you're studying along with this, or are you just going off of what is presented in the talks?
It's pretty much the second option. It's people just interested in the in the theme and coming to listen, rather than. But if you have any bibliography that you want to share with the audience, do send it, and we can send it to the people who had registered.
Yeah,
I'm sure that'd be useful.
Well, I think that Jennifer Roberts book that I mentioned called Transporting Visions seems to have made quite an impact on people thinking about the materiality of pictures and how they travel and circulate. So I definitely suggest anyone who's interested in these kind of things to check that book out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Make sure that we circulate the information.
Jonathan, well, I have a question for you. Could you give us a bit more information about your access to archives during your research? I'm very curious about this aspect of your work. Very intrigued.
It was a lot of work. When I started this project, several people told me that they didn't think it was going to work because of the archives wouldn't be there. And it's true that as far as the news photo agencies, a lot of the archives were destroyed, either because of the war, a lot of them from bombing, or because they're companies, and once the company gets sold or goes out of business or whatever, they just trash their archives. So there is a lot missing, but there's enough that still exists that you could do it. And so the way that I did it was, fortunately, a lot of the European telecommunications, of course, was public. Work was through post, telegraph, and telephone ministries, which evolved out of the post offices. So those archives are relatively well preserved since they're state archives. So like in France, that's the case. At the Archives Nationales in Pierrefitte, that was a place to look. And also, even though Great Britain's, it was the same in Great Britain, it was privatized beginning in the 1960s and turned into British Telecom. But the people that managed British Telecom, I think in part because it had the history of being a public utility, believed in the mission of preserving heritage. So they have a very nice archive, actually, even though it's now a private company.
Is it private now?
Yeah, it's private, but they have a really good archive. The AP is another big one. That was a little bit harder because it's a corporation and they're kind of sensitive about their image and all of that, but they do have a well organized archive. I just kind of, and I'm not scathingly critical of them or something like some scholars might be, but I was kind of like, I didn't tell them everything that I was going to say. I was just like, I'm interested in this technology and how it developed. Like I tried to make it as like apolitical as possible in my explanation to them of what I was doing, and then they let me see their stuff. Sometimes photographers, even though a lot of these pictures are anonymously produced, I found some photographers who had archives. Like there's one whose archive ended up in the North Carolina State University library system, which is like a huge correspondence, mostly with his brother who worked for the AP in New York, and he was sending letters to him from all over the world, and a lot of them were how he was always keeping in mind not just how he was going to get the picture, but how he was then going to get it to the nearest radio station, and sort of like how he worked with telecommunications infrastructure. So, and then for this chapter, the OWI files are at the National Archives in Maryland.
In Maryland, okay.
So, yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot of work.
It must have been.
Mm.
I have a question. Jonathan, could you please elaborate on manipulation with the negatives, if they were edited or if they were, by which means?
Yeah, they definitely were edited. I mean, in some ways, because like the picture I show of Charles Lindbergh, I'm talking, that was a picture that's what comes out, like what's printed out of that little black box on the machine. So it's not what's printed in the newspaper. Often that print would go to the newspaper, and then the newspaper has what they called an art department, which has, you know, artists, not named artists, but like, you know, technical workers who would use pens and brushes and ink and that kind of stuff to like draw on the print. And then that would be run through a halftone matrix to produce the photo engraving that would go into the newspaper.
But
So
did
you have these layers of work, and some of the work is like is through mechanical devices, and some of the work is by hand. So in the end, you end up with, you know, like something more like, well, this maybe, but I'm trying to find a better example. I mean, like this is a good example. Because here you see you can't see much handwork, much of this drawing on the image in this one, but you see the pattern of lines. That's from the machine itself. But here you don't really see a pattern of lines, but you can clearly see that they were drawing on it, which I get, it's an aesthetic choice, I guess, in the end, which is like you don't want to see the lines from the image, and so the art department would draw on it. Often the thing, mostly when people talk about like manipulating images, there are examples, but I think it was much more common. It's not that they were trying to lie or like put things in the image that weren't there. It's more about emphasizing the information that you want the image to convey, like cleaning it up, removing or like kind of massaging the noise in the image that comes from the transmission process. Or yeah, you know, like there might be a picture, there'll be a picture from the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, and it's like some Italian tanks going through a landscape, and they remove all the grass and bushes, or like they leave one bush but remove most of it. And I think it's because it probably just looked visually messy on the print, and they want the tanks to be the focus of attention in the image that gets reproduced in the newspaper. So that's more what they would do than kind of like, yeah, adding in something that's not there or something like that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, do you think it's possible theoretically to find the original negatives and maybe to compare what we saw in the newspapers and what was shot originally, or they're completely destroyed? What do you think?
Well, sometimes they're destroyed, but oftentimes it is possible. And in fact, I mean, one of the hardest things about this kind of research is that it's often the negatives, the original negatives, that survive when the archives do survive, because the negatives would be used to make a print that would be what would be transmitted. And then the print made on the other end of the transmission process would be what was used to make a photo engraving in the daily newspaper. But then that original negative would be shipped from wherever it was, you know, originally produced back to the headquarters. So like you've got a photojournalist in India, and they take a picture of Gandhi's funeral in 1948. And then they, as quickly as they can, they go to Bombay, now Mumbai, to send to radio the image. But then after they go to the radio station, they go to the post office and they mail their negatives. And so first the image is printed from the radio photo, but then a month later, the negatives get to New York. And they toss the print from the radio photo, and they archive the negatives that were mailed because they're sharper images, and they think that those will have more, we can sell them again later, you know, for a book that's like the 20th century by the Associated Press or something like that. So they're always thinking ahead to how can we eventually monetize our archive, and what are the pictures that are going to like stand in for this event in historical memory. So the radio photo is just good for like getting the news as fast as possible in this kind of ugly way. And then it's the sharp prints that will be what we'll see 10, 20, 100 years down the road.
Thank you.
So I guess that's another interesting example, an interesting thing maybe to think about if in a seminar on kind of like material culture and digital material culture, is when things look a certain way, the way that we see the digital images that we see now is almost certain not to be how they're archived. So the way that our material culture will look in the future will be different from how we see it now. And if you're doing work as a historian that's trying to pay attention to the materiality of culture, it's very difficult to get around the way that the archive has kind of like processed that materiality and the look of that materiality. In terms of getting, how did things look at the time? How did they feel at the time? All those kinds of things. I mean, it's a question of like the ephemerality of material culture.
Thank you very much. I was fascinated by all the kind of interplays between space being annihilated and being reasserted through materiality. You know, what you discussed about the archives, the missing archives, or the archives that are sparse in relation to materiality. It's always the same question of, you know, like if the sources don't survive themselves, the fragility of things, and then the kind of gaps in the archives and how you recreate that. Are there any more questions from the audience, or did you want Jonathan to
add something?
Add something?
No, maybe I'll just see if there's any other questions first. I'm curious to know, is anybody working on a project that has to do with sub-Saharan Africa here? This isn't just for, well, this is LARCA related, so everyone's everyone's working on an Anglophone subject of one kind or another. Okay.
Not necessarily.
But not okay. Well, I mean, it's open to anyone who wants to join, but yeah. No, well, I'm just, because it's only because it's hard. I'm trying to improve this chapter right now, and I had thought that picture of the young Africans looking at the photo display board was in Brazzaville, but then I presented this at a conference, and someone informed me, actually, that's not in Brazzaville. That's in Accra. Or they thought it was in Nigeria. Actually, I found out it was in Accra. But it's hard. Most of my work has been on like American history and European history, and so this is something that I'm kind of trying to deal with.
Well, last year I worked on Nigerian British photographer Rotimi Fani-Kiyot, so a little bit I touched upon Nigerian photography. I can recommend you some books on Nigerian photography because it was kind of developed there. They had their local artists. I think it was maybe a bit later than 40s, maybe in the 50s, but the time frame is a little bit similar to yours. So yeah, but I'm not an expert at anyway, just like some cultural, it was more cultural thing because I was looking for some religious traces in photography.
Yeah, it seems like most from the research I've done, it seems like most of the literature is about post-war stuff. There's a little bit though. I think that I found some things about like portrait studios that are pretty. It seems like there were some that opened fairly early on, like 1860s, 70s, 80s, but yeah, but I'm interested in the press, and there's not much there. It's been difficult for me to find very much about it.
I have a question, Jonathan, about this particular picture you were talking about of the the group of Africans watching the war picture board. Okay, you said that it is somewhat staged.
It might be. It might be. I just don't know.
How do you go about guessing how much staging there is in the pictures you look at?
I don't know because well, with this one, I just thought it could be staged. It could not be. Maybe it seems to fit the narrative that the OWI wanted to portray.
Yeah. It's
and
perfect.
For that reason, I thought it's possible. It's certainly possible that it's staged. So in that sense, I wanted to make my interpretation of it valid, no matter whether it was staged or not.
Well,
that whether it's staged or not, the fact, even if, let's say, so if the photographer asked them, could you stand like this? Could you look at this? They still knew that this is something that they were being positioned as the audience for the pictures. Now you can say that that's different from an actually existing public, because the public should be something that's, I guess, a little bit more organic or participatory. But I think that that's why, in the end, I kind of feel like there was the public. I say in the talk, the public remained more potential than actual.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the staging, even if there was no, positioning, and you point at the picture, please, just in the selection of the image and the one that's remained, the one that was developed and that has come to you, that there's a process, a selection process there. So you could argue that's part of the staging as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but there are other points in the archive, in the OWR archive, where they have letters from colonial, civil servants who talk about the interest that the picture displays have for African people. So I do think it's probably not going too far to say that there was interest in these things on the part of Africans. Now, what's really hard is getting a sense of what did they make of them? What did African people, what did they mean to them? In this picture, the message is quite clear. They're saying, like, this is a power, this military international power. But there's an interesting paper that's come out about they're photos by an OWI photographer of African masquerade dancers. They're from southern Nigeria, but there's the traditional format of these masquerades is there's like a headdress, the face is covered, and there's a headdress. Usually it's like a fish, which is representative of a water spirit. And has to do with like the other world and the gifts that come from the water, because these people, a lot of their economy is fishing and trading on the Niger Delta. But during World War II, they started integrating like models of army planes onto the headdress. So instead of a fish, you would have an army plane. And so the question is, like, what does this mean to them? What do they think about this huge infrastructural, military, economic change that's going on? You know, there's a lot of urbanization happening in Africa at the time. There's new kinds of like wage labor because there's an economic boom around like rubber and metals. So the society is changing and there's these like ways of reacting to it. But the question, like the OWI wants to say, what it means is that they really respect the power of the United States. And they see this as a great like magical power. But it's not so clear necessarily that that's what it means. And it takes a lot of work in terms of like figuring out African ritual and cosmology and belief system, which the OW, obviously, like none of that meant anything really to the OWI. They just had this very general idea about juju, which is kind of a Western construct. So that's the really difficult thing to get at, I think, especially from the archive that I'm working with, and I'm not an anthropologist.
Well, you are in some way.
Well, I am. Yeah, I'm in some way. I'm not an anthropologist specialized in like the customs and rituals of the people who live around Brazzaville.
Yeah.
And more to the point, neither were the OWI workers.
Yeah.
Well. But yeah.
Your cat has learned a lot from your conference.
Yeah. Yeah. He should. By now he should be well on his way to getting a PhD.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this fantastic first talk of the season. We're very pleased and we're very grateful.
I'm happy. I was happy to participate. I'm looking forward to the upcoming ones too. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to send me an email.
Thank you.